In this episode of Dark Tower YouTube, we get to eat fancy lobster dinner again and again and again. We have Stephen King pop into our story several times. We meet the Lady of Shadows, and we are going to psychoanalyze the heck out of her. And you'll get to hear me fumble through various accents. Welcome to Dark Tower YouTube. My name is Michelle McEwen. I am your host. And I'm so glad to be back with you. It's been a minute. It's longer than I would like to go between episodes, but it's just so much going on here. And I was editing myself and saying, you can't say all of that. But here at Dark Tower YouTube, we're doing a deep psychological dive into the magic, the mystery, the metaphysics, the philosophy, the psychology of it all. And so if we're not going to psychoanalyze the Lady of Shadows to the nth degree, then what am I even doing with my life? So we're doing it, and it's going to take as long as it takes. It's probably going to take at least 2 episodes. I would like these to be in digestible chunks, digestible, buttery, lobstrosity chunks, if you will. So we need to get right into it. This is covering Reshuffle and Lady of Shadows Chapter 1 and 2 and 3. This is Book 2 of The Dark Tower. I didn't say that, but you read the description. You guys know what's up. We're on the drawing of the 3, right? Okay. Here we go with Shuffle. In Shuffle, both of our characters, Eddie and Roland, are on the brink of death. Eddie's withdrawing from heroin. Roland is dying of infection from the lobstrosity attack. Eddie gives Roland antibiotics that they took from Balazar's, and he starts shooting the lobstrosities and using them as a food source. And he keeps them alive, both of them. Eddie Dean. Let's talk about the story structure here, because this is unusual. And it's unlike anything we've read before up until this point. Maybe ever. Why is this section called Shuffle? What's going on here? I think very obviously we have a theme of cards in the drawing of the 3, and continuing on from our tarot deck idea of the last book. And so we're kind of shuffling around in Roland's consciousness, and isn't it a creative way to do that? We're kind of shuffling in the fever dream. And if you know what it's like to be feverish and not all there, in and out of consciousness even, then you get it. The shuffling of time and people and conversations gets real weird. So I think Stephen King is a master of creative writing here. He's not just telling us the things that happened. He's putting us in Roland's point of view and giving us a lot of empathy for that character, which we love to do ourselves. And we like it when Stephen King does that too. So, okay. Also, the idea of the card shuffle, I think, is what we're seeing when we're in this kind of haze of the fever dream. And these cards are like shown to us. A scene comes into our consciousness. Did that happen? Or maybe the card falls out of the deck. We're shuffling too fast and there goes the card. What was that? And it was just this momentary glimpse before it went back in the deck. So we're just really kind of feeling out this theme of shuffle here today. And let's go a little deeper. Another shuffling I would like to consider is the shuffling of the characters of Roland and Henry. Henry has been sadly taken out of Eddie's deck of cards, and Roland has been inserted in there. And we're going to see that Roland is indeed being shuffled into the space that Henry used to fill for Eddie. And perhaps it's an easier fit than any of us could have anticipated. I think another shuffle is whether Eddie and Roland are going to live and die. This is the shuffle of their ka. This is life and death, the shuffle of life and death, because they're both seriously close to death. Roland actually brings up the idea of life and death at the start of this section. I'm going to read that now and pay attention here to how it also seems that Roland is thinking about himself and his life from this card metaphor standpoint now. The tarot reading, the idea of the drawing, he's embodied that. It is entrenched within his psyche, and that's being reflected back to him and to us. King writes, "Only two choices here," Roland whispers. "Don't know how it is in your world, but only two choices here. Stand and maybe live, or die on your knees with your head down and the stink of your own armpits in your nose. Nothing," he hacks out a cough, "nothing to me." "Who are you?" Eddie screams at him. "Your destiny, Eddie," the gunslinger whispers. "Why don't you just eat shit and die?" Eddie asks him. The gunslinger tries to speak, but before he can, he floats off as the cards shuffle. Kablam! Roland opens his eyes on a billion stars wheeling through the blackness, then closes them again. He doesn't know what's going on, but he still thinks everything's okay. The deck's still moving. The cards still shuffle. Wow. Oh, I love this so much. Such great writing there. A side note is this idea of standing. So at this point, this book was 1987, and King had written The Stand at that point. And the idea of stand and be true is one that King loves. And we see it in other works of his, but especially in The Stand, the eponymous Stand. But here, that idea of stand and maybe live. So I wonder if he was thinking of that when he wrote this. Really neither here nor there. Just a little tidbit for you fans of Stephen King out there. I think one last meaning that I want to pull out of this, a meta meaning, if you will, is that King is shuffling the deck of the book, of the story, and he's choosing to draw for us certain scenes, certain images, conversations that he wants us to see. The drawing of the three is ultimately King's card game, and so he gets to shuffle, pull, and show us the cards. Any other shuffling metaphors that y'all are thinking of or thought of as you were reading this part? We had compared Roland's leading up to Eddie's door to his experience leading up to meeting Jake, and we found many similarities. So the lead up was definitely similar. King even pointed that out to us. But let's pause for a moment and just reflect on what was behind magical door number 1 and what were the similarities there with Jake. Behind door number 1, of course, was Jake's New York City, just a few years later. Of all the places and times that door could open on, it was New York City. So that feels like a connection, pretty solid connection. Jake saved Roland's life upon their meeting, and then at least once more under the mountains. And here, Eddie has saved Roland's life multiple times. But very specifically in this chapter, he saves Roland's life when Roland is seriously on the brink of illness and death. I think we've seen enough out of Eddie at this point to say that he, like Jake, is another gunslinger in the rough. And also, like Jake, Eddie gets Roland's number pretty quickly and calls him out on it, just like Jake did. And we'll see that in a minute. Both men are slowly improving, and a barely conscious Roland tells Eddie to start moving them north up the beach. Eddie makes a travois, I don't know if that's how you say that, to pull Roland along. Roland at first makes fun of this ramshackle contraption, but then he admits that number 1, Eddie at least tried, and 2, it's actually working. So he should stop being mean about it and have a little respect for this man who's doing a really good job. And this shows us, just like Jake, Eddie is also resourceful and industrious, and he knows how to make his way in this foreign world. That's not nothing, that's big. We can have some empathy for Eddie here. What a wild thing to happen to him. And he is thriving, just like Jake did. We learn a lot about Eddie's character in this section. And we come to know that he's not just keeping Roland alive so that he can go back to New York City. He tells Roland that he almost killed himself on a really hard day. And when Roland asks why, Eddie talks about, well, if you shoot yourself, but he has these wet bullets, you know? And he's like, if I got up the courage to do it, and then I pulled the trigger, and it was one of those duds, everybody knows that you poop your pants when that happens, and you can't get the smell of shit out of your pants. And this makes Roland go into hysterics, which I love, and I know you probably love at this point. We don't see Roland laughing very often. And so for Eddie to make him laugh here is just wonderful. So we take a moment and appreciate that. But then Roland is curious, and he wants to know more about what Eddie's motivations were. King writes, "Wait," he whispers, and Eddie looks at him. "Why, really?" "I guess because you needed me. If I'd killed myself, you would have died. Later on, after you're really on your feet again, I may, re-examine my options." He looks around and sighs deeply. "There may be a Disneyland or Coney Island somewhere in your world, Roland, but what I've seen of it so far doesn't interest me that much." He starts away, pauses, and looks back again at Roland. His face is somber, although some of the sickly pallor has left it. The shakes have become no more than occasional tremors. "Sometimes you really don't understand me, do you?" "No," the gunslinger whispers. "Sometimes I don't." "Then I'll elucidate. There are people who need people to need them. The reason you don't understand is because you're not one of those people. You'd use me and then toss me away like a paper bag, if that's what it came down to. God fucked you, my friend. You're just smart enough so it would hurt you to do that, and just hard enough so you'd go ahead and do it anyway. You wouldn't be able to help yourself. If I was lying on the beach there and screaming for help, you'd walk over me. If I was between you and your goddamn tower. Isn't that pretty close to the truth?" Roland says nothing, only watches Eddie. "But not everyone is like that. There are people who need people to need them. Like the Barbra Streisand song, corny but true. It's just another way of being hooked through the bag." Eddie gazes at him. "But when it comes to that, you're clean, aren't you?" Roland watches him. "Except for your tower." Eddie utters a short laugh. "You're a tower junkie, Roland." "Which war was it?" Roland whispers. "What?" "The one where you got your sense of nobility and purpose shot off." Eddie recoils, as if Roland has reached out and slapped him. Couple of things here. It's true that Eddie was a junkie and had no real purpose in his life, but all of that changed the moment that Roland stepped inside of his mind. Since that point, we've seen an industrious and resourceful gunslinger in training here who saved Roland's life multiple times. So I think Eddie is right here, and I think Roland's being a real asshole. What do you think about this? And Eddie has Roland's number because While Eddie knows nothing about Jake, Roland has not shared that with him. He pretty much describes exactly what Roland did to Jake. So I think Roland here just can't handle the truth and is projecting hardcore. Roland's sense of nobility and purpose is what we're keeping our eyes on, because we're not impressed with either one of those things at this point. And we are impressed with Eddie. Roland is conscious more and more, and he's healing, and he's finally able to move himself, so they start walking. And as they walk, Eddie tells Roland the story of Henry. It's a story that Roland already knows, but Roland knows that it's important for Eddie to tell this story to himself. Henry went to Vietnam. He was injured, sent home addicted to morphine. He starts snorting heroin to get his fix, and soon he has his little brother Eddie doing the same. And this progresses as you might expect, as it usually does, in the usual sad way. Just as Eddie is wrapping up this story, an odd thing happens on the storytelling front. And this is what I was referring to earlier when I was thinking about King shuffling the deck of the story, showing us the cards that we need to know about. Stephen King starts talking to us directly. So far, he's been telling this story in the third-person omniscient point of view, or the limited third-person point of view. But all of a sudden here, he shifts into an authorial, how do you say that word? Authorial commentator of sorts, relaying his thoughts on the character of Roland. In other words, he's sharing something with us that neither character is aware of or thinking about. I'm going to read it to you so you refresh your memory. I'm sure this snagged your brain a little bit because it was different to what had been happening. King writes, "Another man, less pragmatic and more introspective than Roland, might have asked to himself, if not right out loud, why this one? Why this man to start? Why a man who seems to promise weakness or strangeness or even outright doom?" Not only did the gunslinger never ask the question, it never even formulated itself in his mind. Cuthbert would have asked. Cuthbert had questioned everything, had been poisoned with questions, had died with one in his mouth. Now they were gone, all gone. Court's last gunslingers, the 13 survivors of a beginning class that had numbered 56, were all dead. All dead but Roland. He was the last gunslinger, going steadily on in a world that had grown stale and sterile and empty. So, Stephen King just inserted his viewpoint into the story. He's talking about something that no one within this story is privy to, with this bit about how this question had never even formulated itself in Roland's mind. This is metafiction, and we're going to keep our eyes peeled moving forward for any more of this kind of thing. And we're going to find it multiple times. I think he shifted his storytelling here because he wants us to ask that question. He's like, Roland is not going to ask the question because it's not in his character to do that. But y'all should be asking that question. So we're going to ask the question, why Eddie? Why him first? As we get to door number 2 with Our Lady of Shadows, we realize that that would have been a complete disaster had Roland chosen her first. And we don't know who's behind door number 3 yet, so we can't comment on that. But Eddie saved Roland's life. That's one reason why. The timing here, too, is so interesting. So King poses this question to us right after we learn all about Henry and the Dean brothers dynamic. There are people who need people to need them, Eddie said. Eddie needed Henry to need him. I remember the last episode when we heard Eddie saying to Henry, if you die, then what did I live for? And we said we'd watch how that dynamic was going to show up in his relationship with Roland. Remember that? Feels like a long time ago. I do. Well, this is it. Here it is. Eddie needed Henry to need him. And now he needs Roland to need him. That's why he saved his life. That's one reason why he saved his life. He told us that. So this all makes sense. Why Eddie? Why him first? And I think that's why Roland's slight hurt Eddie's feelings so badly there. And I think it was super mean, Roland. It was super mean. Eddie already loves Roland. And he looks up to him. And he needs Roland around to feel needed. And he wants Roland to love and need him too, because that's what we all want. This could be considered a weakness in Eddie. But I believe it is a weakness that kept Roland alive. So why this man who has this weakness? The weakness in Eddie is what made Roland possible. Roland still exists because of that weakness in Eddie. Eddie said, if I'd killed myself, you would have died. So he essentially here sacrificed what he wanted. He wants to go back through the door. He wants heroin, and we're going to get that later. But he didn't do that. He didn't kill himself. He didn't try to go on to the next door himself. He sacrifices what he wanted to save Roland because he is the kind of person who needs Roland to need him. It's important that we are learning all about this man. Eddie has for sure put Roland into the space where Henry used to be. And we get a glimpse into Roland's thoughts about Henry and this dynamic. This is right after Eddie tells Roland the story of stealing the car. And Henry stole the car with Eddie in tow, and they're driving around, and Henry thought the cops saw them. And he's like, did they see us? And Eddie knew that they didn't, but he's like, yeah, I think so. And Henry's like, oh shit. And he stops the car and he gets out and he starts running. And Eddie's stuck, he's a little kid, and he can't get out. The door is probably fine, but he can't figure it out. And Henry comes back to get him. And that's very meaningful to Eddie. He came back. You see, that's the important thing about Henry. He did run, but he came back. And he's trying to stress this to Roland. So this is Roland here, thinking about what Eddie has just told him. King writes, people like Henry always came back because people like Henry knew how to use trust. It was the only thing people like Henry did know how to use. First, they changed trust into need. Then, they changed need into a drug. And once that was done, what was Eddie's word for it? Push. Yes, they pushed it. So we're thinking about how Eddie has definitely put Roland into Henry's spot, but how does that look from our perspective? Is Roland a good stand-in for Henry? And I think in our deep psychological dive into Roland, we've seen quite a bit of projection out of him, where his opinion of somebody else is what he's doing, and he's shitting all over everybody while he's the one that's doing the thing. So examples of that are when he was like, Hacks the cook, he murders children. That's what you did, Roland. And when he's talking about the adults playing their games and how he's just railing against that. And that's exactly what he's doing with Jake. So that's that's what projection is. When you're just pointing the finger, like, look at what those assholes are doing. And it's like, that's you, Roland. So many times we've seen him do that. I think he's doing that here again. In the next chapter, we're going to see, I think this is true, and we're going to see how Roland's projection of Henry plays out through his own actions. So remember this, because we're going to come back to it. And I think it's not just Eddie putting Roland into Henry's shoes, but Roland filling those shoes and playing the part of Henry unconsciously, of course, Roland. But so we'll get there. We'll get there when we get there. Okay, let's get back to the story where King gives us more details about the fall of Gilead. Court was poisoned and the world moved on. Things just fell apart. King writes, so he was the last, and perhaps he had survived because the dark romance in his nature was overset by his practicality and simplicity. He understood that only 3 things mattered: mortality, Ka, and the tower. Those were enough things to think about. Are they though, Roland? Are they? Okay, you've survived this long, fair enough. But at what price? Because you're not doing all that great from what we've seen of you. You've only really survived through the kindness of friends, and they're not even people that know you. These strangers have saved you. And all of these friends, including your old ones that were your friends, they're all dead now. And at least one of them was a sacrifice for the tower, poor little Jake. You yourself, Roland, worried about obtaining the tower as a monster. Back in the Gunslinger, do you remember that? And he's going to do it again here in a bit. So perhaps more things matter than mortality, Ka, and the tower. And perhaps one of those things is love. And perhaps it would serve you to make some time to think about it. But Roland didn't ask me, so he doesn't know any of this. Too bad. So sad. All right, back to the book where Eddie finally finishes his story. And he's waiting and waiting and waiting for some kind of response from Roland. And Roland, the asshole, just keeps walking and not saying anything. Finally, Eddie just asks. King writes, so, what do you think? I think you're here. Eddie stopped, fisted hands planted on his hips. That's all? That's it? That's all I know, the gunslinger replied. His missing fingers and toe throbbed and itched. He wished for some of the Aston from Eddie's world. You don't have any opinion on what the hell it all means? The gunslinger might have held up his subtracted right hand and said, think about what this means, you silly idiot. But it no more crossed his mind to say this than it had to ask why it was Eddie out of all the people in the universe that might exist. It's Ka, he said, facing Eddie patiently. What's Ka? Eddie's voice was truculent. I never heard of it. Except if you say it twice, you come out with a baby word for shit. I don't know about that, the gunslinger said. Here, it means duty or destiny, or in the Vulgate, a place you must go. Eddie managed to look dismayed, disgusted, and amused all at the same time. Then say it twice, Roland, because words like that sound like shit to this kid. This is a great illustration of what Roland just told us about himself. In his response to Eddie, he is thinking about Ka, mortality, and the tower. And there's zero empathy, compassion, understanding, or love coming from Roland in response to Eddie spilling his guts in a major way for the first time in his life. And notice how King popped up there again, acting as that insider voice, asking the question for us that Roland isn't asking. Think about what this means, you silly idiot. No, you, Roland. You think about what that means, you silly idiot. Now, he didn't ask the question, so we're asking it, but we're asking Roland as well. And in fact, we're so smart here at Dark Tower YouTube because we already asked and answered this question way back in the prologue, remember? What does it mean? Well, Roland, if you had chosen love over the tower, if you had chosen Jake, the white, instead of the man in black, the dark tower, your subtracted fingers and toe would probably still be attached to your body. But Roland doesn't even think to ask these questions at this point, so no one can tell him the answer. It's around this time that they come upon the second door, unsurprisingly marked, the Lady of Shadows. Eddie wants to go through, but Roland tells him to stay. Roland allows Eddie to take his gun and allows himself to be threatened by it, but he doesn't flinch with the death threat. King writes, "You stay here." "You think I don't mean it?" Eddie was shrill now, close to the edge. The gunslinger could almost see him looking down into the drifty depths of his own damnation. Whew. Eddie thumbed back the revolver's ancient hammer. The wind had fallen with the break of day and ebb of the tide, and the click of the hammer as Eddie brought it to full cock was very clear. "You just try me." "I think I will," the gunslinger said. "I'll shoot you!" Eddie screamed. "Ka," the gunslinger replied stolidly and turned toward the door. He was reaching for the knob, but his heart was waiting to see if he would live or die. Ka. Whew. Okay, so let's stop and just appreciate the beautiful writing here and the alliteration that I messed up. Down into the drifty depths of his own damnation. Whew. It's just a choir of angels singing there. Wonderful, wonderful. Anyway, that's where we're going to leave Roland and Eddie at the end of Shuffle. And we're going to move into chapter 1 of the next section, The Lady of Shadows. The first chapter is called Detta and Odetta. King, once again, briefly steps outside of the action to set up this section. He's presenting to us the idea of Adler's perfect schizophrenic and how we're about to meet that person in the character of Odetta Holmes and Detta Walker. A little psychological note here. Odetta's condition, if she were a real person, would likely be diagnosed as dissociative identity disorder and not schizophrenia. So quick little psychology lesson. Dissociative identity disorder, they could have made it easier to say, I think, is characterized by multiple distinct identities, check. Amnesia or gaps in memory, check. And identity switches, also check. Whereas schizophrenia is characterized by delusions, not really, hallucinations, disorganized thinking and speech, not really. So if we're using the DSM whatever number criteria, it's dissociative. I'm going to call it DID. That's just easier for me at this point in my day, okay? It's not schizophrenia. Back in the 80s, I don't know. It's like Eddie's diagnosing her as schizophrenic, and he doesn't know what's going on, and Roland's just like, okay. But Stephen King talking about schizophrenia as Stephen King, I think it needed to be said. Okay? So I said it. All right. In the prisoner section, we didn't get any glimpse into Eddie's world until Roland opened up the door. However, here, we meet Odetta before Roland opens the door onto Detta. King moves around in time to introduce us to these two ladies, taking us from Odetta's conversation in the limo into her backstory. We get into this Detta Walker dreamlike stream of consciousness memory. And so if you were feeling at all a little disoriented, discombobulated during this section, I think King once again is being purposely brilliant by writing in such a way that his writing is reflecting the qualities of the character back to us. Remember, he did a similar thing with Eddie, where when we were inside of Eddie's mind, we could really get the feeling of what it was like to be him. And how different that was from being inside Roland's mind for so long in The Gunslinger. We really felt that. And I think that King is being very intentional here with his writing. I think he always is. And it works to make me feel like, I'm remembering when I read this for the first time so many years ago, I remember feeling confused. And I remember feeling like there's different things happening and we have different puzzle pieces going on and slices of time and opposing thoughts and feelings. And I'm feeling like it's taken me a minute to get oriented to what the fuck is happening. Do you see what he did there? For funsies, and in keeping with the action of this book, we're also allowed into Andrew the chauffeur's mind to see what he thinks about this whole thing. And he's like, this is all fucking weird and chaotic. I don't super understand what's going on with this lady. But I think King does a good enough job of keeping us oriented to the character, so that after you read the chapter, you could definitely report back a few key things about her. And if you can't, don't worry, because we're going to go through it all, and I mean all, together, now. How we meet Odetta is interesting. We learn she is rich first, being driven in a limo to Central Park West by a chauffeur. We next learn that she is black, as she relays her time spent in Oxford. Then we learn about her other identity, Detta, and we learn that Detta and Odetta don't know about each other, at least not consciously. We learn that Odetta is a very well-known, famous person in the civil rights movement. And finally, we learn that she is in a wheelchair, and she has been for the last 5 years after an accident took her legs. We're introduced to Detta Walker in a similar way that we were to Eddie, with a long stream of consciousness run-on sentence that puts Eddie's run-on sentence to shame. We were being asked to exist with Eddie in the mind of a junkie, and now we're being asked to exist in the mind of a monstrous personality who exists only briefly, with large blank spaces in between. We meet Odetta just as Andrew is saying, America's Last Gunslinger, which catches our attention and shakes Odetta out of her daydream. She was daydreaming in the limo, much like Eddie was kind of tuning out the cabbie. So I feel like there's a lot of mirroring that goes on in this book, and I don't bring it up every time because we would be here for 30 years, but it feels like that's intentional. And she doesn't like the idea of JFK being linked to gun violence, but she gets goosebumps anyway. So let's read through a part of this scene, and then we're going to see what we can pull out of it. Now, this is Andrew talking to Odetta, and he's Irish, and I've been practicing a little bit, and I'm going to thank my dialect coach. You know who you are. Probably with some more time, this would be way better, so just bear with me, okay? King writes, Jack Kennedy was different, that's all. He said he would draw, but only if someone waker needed him to draw, and only if there was nothing else to do. He said Kennedy was savvy enough to know that sometimes talking don't do no good. He said Kennedy knew if it's foaming at the mouth, you have to shout it. His eyes continued to regard her apprehensively. Besides, it was just some column I read. The limo was gliding up Fifth Avenue now, headed towards Central Park West. The Cadillac emblem on the roof, the Cadillac emblem on the end of the hood, cutting the frigid February air. Yes, Odetta said mildly, and Andrew's eyes relaxed a trifle. I understand. I don't agree, but I understand. You are a liar, a voice spoke up in her mind. This was a voice she heard quite often. She had even named it. It was the voice of the goad. You understand perfectly and agree completely. Lie to Andrew if you feel it necessary. But for God's sake, don't lie to yourself, woman. Yet part of her protested, horrified. In a world which had become a nuclear powder keg upon which nearly 1 billion people now sat, it was a mistake. Perhaps one of suicidal proportions, to believe there was a difference between good shooters and bad shooters. There were too many shaky hands holding lighters near too many fuses. This was no world for gunslingers. If there ever had been a time for them, it had passed. Hadn't it? Okay, so in other words, the world had moved on. You caught that one, right? We're going to look at how similar Odetta is to Roland a little later, but this is our first hint at the similarities that King is asking us to see. Do you remember all the way back on page 1 of The Gunslinger, when we were introduced to Roland? Remember, King wrote, this is Roland thinking, why should that business make him think of his horn and the last of his old friends, both lost so long ago at Jericho Hill? He still had the guns, his father's guns, and surely they were more important than horns, or even friends. Weren't they? Both Roland and Odetta here are questioning their core values, centering around guns and violence. And they both end it with that, it's like they start with this self-assuredness, I know, and then they end with this doubt in themselves. So that structure of thought, I think, is intentional. And we'll come back to that later, because there's way more similarities between these characters. A few more things I want to pull out here. I think Andrew's description of JFK as a gunslinger, it sounds like what we know about Roland. Would you agree? I mean, except for the part where Kennedy let the child fall to his death. Another point I want to look at is how our first introduction to Odetta being a lady of shadows, it starts pretty much immediately. She lied to Andrew here, saying one thing to him one way and then thinking the opposite thing in a totally different way. She does this again after she tells him about being held in the jail cell in Oxford and being forced to wet herself when they wouldn't let her or her friends out to use the bathroom. And she tells that story in a way that she feels she shouldn't. That to tell Andrew this real story would be needlessly brutal. But she can't hold back. King writes, and this is now just after Odetta has finished blurting out this story to Andrew. King writes, she saw Andrew's eyes in the rearview mirror and was sorry for the way his eyes looked. Sometimes your urine wasn't the only thing you couldn't hold. I'm sorry, Ms. Holmes. No, she said, rubbing at her temples again. I am the one who is sorry. It's been a trying 3 days, Andrew. I should think so. I should think so, he said, in a shocked old maidish voice that made her laugh in spite of herself. But most of her wasn't laughing. She thought she had known what she was getting into, that she fully anticipated how bad it could get. She had been wrong. A trying 3 days. Well, that was one way to put it. Another might be that her 3 days in Oxford, Mississippi had been a short season in hell. But there were some things you couldn't say. Some things you would die before saying, unless you were called upon to testify to them before the throne of God the Father Almighty, where, she supposed, even the truths that caused the hellish thunderstorms in that strange gray jelly between your ears. Scientists said that gray jelly was nerveless, and if that wasn't a hoot and a half, she didn't know what was. Must be admitted. I just want to get home and bathe, 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 and sleep, sleep, sleep. Then I reckon I'll be as right as rain. All right, I'm just going to point out the 3 theme here in case you're falling asleep on that. 3 days in Oxford, 3 bathes, 3 sleeps, and a schoolhouse rock. And then De La Soul famously said, 3 is a magic number. Okay, but way bigger than that. Did you notice that it's when Odetta is lying to herself and or others that the headaches are triggered, which we'll learn is a sign that Detta is about to take over the body that they share. And the bit about the thunderstorm between her ears. So these headaches that precede Detta, in other words, how these truths must be admitted. So I think this is a hint that even though Odetta isn't consciously aware of Detta, her subconscious could confess the Detta personality to Almighty God if called upon to do so. Anyway, it's right after she lies to Andrew about the good shooters and the bad shooters that she gets the first indication of this headache coming on. In addition to the lying, it is also pointed out to us that Odetta is getting worked up and she's getting kind of angry and irritated during this JFK conversation. And Andrew starts to become apprehensive about her emotionality. But then, when she reverts to speaking mildly, saying, I understand, but I don't agree, then he relaxes a bit. And that's when she starts thinking about what a liar she is. She lied to both of them. And I think she lied to Andrew to make him feel better. And she lied to herself because any ideology of violence is against the way that she's choosing to participate in the civil rights movement. Okay, next, did you notice how in this exchange she apologizes to Andrew? And she reverts from becoming emotionally engaged in this conversation. She reverts to this nicey-nice talk. She doesn't need to apologize for any of this. And she's definitely not going to be right as rain after taking a bath. Why would her saying that 3 days in Oxford were a short season in hell be something that she should never say? It doesn't make any sense. That this is something that she would die before saying. Odetta has every right to be enraged, traumatized, and sad about what happened to her in Oxford. And she has every right to speak this truth and let Andrew feel as upset and awkward as he's going to feel. King's extreme language for Odetta is an indication of how strongly she feels that she can't speak these things out loud. I think Odetta's emotionality, which she's suppressing that and she's judging it as harshly as you can judge anything, might also be a big part of what brings the Detta personality forward. So the lies, the suppression of emotion and the judgment that it's wrong to feel or think these things. These are all preceding Detta emerging. Because Detta comes forth in these moments to acknowledge the truth of the horror of it all. It's Detta who is open and honest with her emotions, and she feels her feelings to the fullest extent, which is healthy, isn't it? We'll learn in chapter 3 that Detta was born when Odetta was struck on the head with a brick, but Detta only surfaced a few times since that incident. Detta wasn't much of a force to be reckoned with until Odetta lost her legs in the subway accident. That second hate crime broke Odetta, physically severing her legs and psychologically splitting her personality more deeply. The subway incident gave Detta more of a reason to be angry, to have big feelings about hate crimes and injustice. It gave her more reason to want to be seen and heard. She wants everybody to know about the unfairness of it all. Detta wants everyone to know that even as a black lady with no legs, who is super angry, who talks as crassly as possible, she wants everyone to know that she still deserves space in this world. She deserves to be heard, acknowledged, validated, perhaps even loved. Although I don't think that's a conscious desire of Detta's. But again, this is what we all want deep down. Are you still with me? We're still on chapter 1, guys. This is going to be a long episode. Everything you wanted to know about Detta Walker and Odetta Holmes. I think this is a good spot to end. It's almost an hour, so I'm going to stop here, and then we're going to come back. Now, I'm on page 13 of about 30 pages, so I think this is a good stopping point. So just take a break, think about all of this. It's big, it's a lot of big things, and we're going to go even deeper and bring up a lot of feelings. And I want to acknowledge that. Obviously, I am a white lady, and I'm talking about civil rights and hate crimes and racist things. So just thank you for allowing me to speak these things into this space. And I would love to hear from anyone if you have any thoughts or feedback about any of this. And just saying that there's probably some triggering things in here. I mean, you already know that if you read the book, but I'm also going to talk about what's underneath of some of those things. So thank you for listening. Thank you for staying tuned. Stay tuned in. Come back. We're going to be back. I don't know. I think I'm going to try to just keep rolling with this once I download this video, but you can take a break. Maybe take a minute, unless you just can't wait to hear more about the Lady of Shadows. So stay tuned, friends. I will see you very soon. And until we meet again, may you have long days and pleasant nights.